Okay, hey. So up next, we're gonna do the Ice King, who is giving a general direction for insight into the comic industry, and I think that's broad enough to start a conversation. And if it sparks questions that you have, type them in the comments below, and it can keep moving this conversation forward. Hopefully, um, I would maybe start by saying that I do love comic books. Um, I buy comics often, but they're usually older comics. I don't buy modern comics. I think the newest thing I've purchased was issue one of Gargoyles that came out a couple months ago, and that's primarily because I love the first two seasons of the cartoon from the 90s, and I know that Greg Weisman is involved, at least in the writing and presumably the direction of the comic. But I haven't read it, and so therefore I don't, there's a, 20-year gap? No, 30 years? Jesus. 30 years gap between the production of that show that I love and this continuation of the story. And so, that's a long time for a creator to change perhaps their approach and opinion to the story and material and characters. And I guess that's probably part of the reason why I haven't read it, that I'm afraid to find out, to be disappointed. Um, I don't find, I mean, like, I buy Batman comics and Spider Man comics and stuff like that, and they typically tend to be from the 80s, maybe into the early 90s. I mean, I would be totally down for buying 70s, and I do. Like, I like to purchase the Luke Cage comics from the 70s and stuff too. So my interest in comic books is there, but the tone and the purpose of them has changed. Like, I don't have any desire to purchase modern day Batman or modern day Spider Man or anything like that. And maybe that's a something we can get into. So insight into the comics industry. My primary starting point, I think, might be to say that the traditional American model, which has changed a little bit over time, thankfully, the traditional model of breaking down the production of a comic into one guy writes it, one guy pencils it, one guy inks it, another person colors it, another person letters it. That's five different people at least, and six if you include the editor kind of overseeing the direction of the thing. Um, Nowadays, we get a lot of the pencil and inker job getting combined into one person. Thankfully, that's how I think a lot of things should be. Um, and then even better if they also can do their own colors, but that still seems to be broadly. I mean, not well, how much do what I know? I don't really pay attention to modern comics, but I don't like that approach because I think of it as a Frankenstein. You have all these different brains, or you know, trying to do their own direction, and they don't. In my experience, which thankfully was consistent. I worked in comics starting with Archie, Sonic, Mega Man, New Crusaders, and I really didn't have a lot of downtime between issues. And then I got involved with IDW on Ninja Turtles, and then the last thing I did was work for DC Comics on mostly their digital imprint at the time, DC Squared or something like that. That was also, they would do the print versions, but the primary focus was digital. And so I did Teen Titans Go comics based on the cartoon, and then one which was the worst comic book job I'd ever been a part of, which was a Scribblenauts like tie-in licensed issue. And we can go into the future someday of why that was the worst. But so what I'm saying is I worked consistently for a number of years, but my experience was limited. I never worked for Marvel Animation. I didn't. I'm not. I did work for Marvel Animation. I didn't work for Marvel Comics on any of their titles. And when I got to the big two, which DC, one of the big two, there it was pretty limited in that still cartoon based or video game based um, part of the universe. So my insight is pretty limited. Uh, but nonetheless, the general thing is that Frankenstein approach. And when, at least with me, I very rarely communicated with any of those other, pieces of the Frankenstein. The most consistent person I ever spoke with was the editor on any project, and I'm assuming that to be the case with the other pieces of the job. Like if the colorist is probably not I mean, for example, I rarely spoke with the colorists that much on any of these projects. Um, so I'm assuming that the colorist is also primarily speaking to the editor. The writer is primarily the letter. Blah blah blah. And I think that's a terrible approach for a cohesive creative piece of media, because let's just stick with Sonic as the starting of my job and where I did the bulk of my comics work. Uh, when I did my layouts, because I'm coming at it from a place where I believe I can do everything, and that's what I wanted to do from the start. I never intended to become just a penciler. I wanted to write and draw my own stories right from the start. I just was working in the American industry, and so that's how it typically broke down. But I should have started doing my own independent comics right from the start. Anyway, as a penciler who thinks that he can do everything, when I did my layouts, I would do the pencils, and then I would also include balloon placement to try and get a sense of the space that it would take up in the panel itself, but also a guide for the letterer to say, here's my intentions of how this reads and why I'm putting this over here and that over here so it doesn't cover up this key piece of information. Now, in the case of Sonic, the letterer that I worked with was John Workman, who I didn't know who he was at the time. I only later learned that he was, somebody who had a really excellent career in the comics industry, and had impact on a lot of different people. In particular, Steve Lieber, the guy that basically is the reason why I became a professional comic book artist. He's the one that gave me the, let's say, chance and mentorship to pursue it professionally. He was directly influenced by John Workman in how Steve would do his balloons. So Steve Lieber had worked up to a place where he was pencil and inking his own art, and he was also doing the letters as part of that part of the deal. That's what he would do, and so he was doing his own letter balloons, and he learned the style that he really liked from John Workman. I don't think he maybe did meet John Workman, but it was just purely looking at John Workman's comics and liking what he did, and then putting it into his own work. Now, I didn't know any of that when I was working with John Workman, but I still think that I'm the person doing the layouts of the pages. I think it's worth at least paying attention to, like, okay, well, that's how he thought it would work, me, when you see the layouts. Now, I doubt that the editor ever shared those layouts with John Workman, just because that seems to be, I could be wrong, but it seems to be the case that in the creation of comic books, there isn't time to run a team that can communicate with each other about their ideas. And maybe there isn't even an interest to do such a thing, because then they start collaborating or gaining strength together, and maybe that's not within a person who's in a position of power, the editor, to really have people starting to align together. I don't know, because there were definitely choices that John Workman made that were not good, and obscured pieces, crucial pieces of information in the pencils. Now, part of that was often that he was working at a much larger lettering size, which I found bizarre, and I can only assume it's because it was a kid's comic, and therefore somebody felt the need that it needed to have letters that were 3 times the size of normal comic book letters. But in particular, sometimes he would place a balloon in a bizarre area to cover. And, I'm not trying to criticize John Workman. I'm just saying that there wasn't... I did a layout to say, here's where I think that balloon should go. He probably never saw that. And so then he just made his decision, and it was not a decision I would make or would have liked to, see. The same thing with the colorist. The colorist doesn't know what my intentions are as the artist, and so in the case of Sonic at Archie, I was mostly working with Matt Herms, who would do a lot of really great work, but we didn't really get the chance to communicate about, like, okay, here's the part where I am intending to draw the eye using, maybe light and dark, like this part should be darker and lighter. Uh, any of that kind of stuff would have just been so helpful to have a basic communication between the two, because it's supposed to be a cohesive piece of finished art. And if you have five different minds going in five different directions with no communication whatsoever, how can it be cohesive? And it most of the time just wasn't. In the case of, like, let's start with the writer. So the writer is creating this story that I'm not really talking to him about any of his intentions or future plans or anything like that. And so then when I get the comic, I'm just gonna try and interpret his words into trying, like, okay, maybe he means this, and maybe this is significant. It's just a bad um, way of creating something, in my opinion. And the animation industry wasn't too different from that. We can get into that some other time if you're interested. Um, yeah, that's the start of my insight that the comic book industry is a Frankenstein, a hideous monster. That really what it should be is more collaboration between team members. You look at some of the best comics in American comic book history, and they're gonna be where the artist and the writer, for example, have co-plotting. Even if they're, like, let's just use John Byrne and Chris Claremont as an example. Even if there's some antagonism there, or some, some different ideas of how things should go that ultimately left John Byrne apparently unhappy, but nonetheless, those guys were able to talk and communicate and try to share ideas and try to land at a place that between the two of them was the most successful story to deliver to an audience. I think that should be, well, no, what I really think is that get rid of the model entirely, that go with more of a manga set where the writer is also the artist. Now, most manga sucks. Most everything sucks. There's Sturgeon's Law, which is based on this if the man actually existed. I think he was a sci-fi author who is apparently is quoted as saying something like 90% of all sci-fi is crud. And just expand that out, the idea of Sturgeon's Revelations or Sturgeon's Law, into everything. 90% of podcasts, 90% of movies, 90% of music. And I believe this. Most of it's crud. Most of it will be forgotten in time, and the best, hopefully, will rise to the top. So the same thing is true with manga. Most manga is crud. Most of them might be good artists, but don't know how to tell a story. But I still think that's the model that would be better to emulate in American comics, where you have an industry focusing on finding the writer artist who is the same person, who knows what they're telling the story and can actually execute it themselves into the visual medium that comic books are. And we have the cream rising to the top, because I mean, let's face it, most comic books suck in the current model, and have for since the dawn of its creation. So we're only changing the model to try and seek those who are best to rise to the top. All right, ask more questions. Hopefully we'll maybe move in another more helpful direction for you.